Hilchos Meiser Perek Shmini, the laws of the Meiser separation, chapter 8. So like every time that we had halachot about food, the Rambam always spends some time dealing with taruves, mixtures. You have meat and milk. What happens if meat and milk mix together? We had a whole section in the laws of truma. What happens if truma mixes into other food? So today we have a chapter, very short chapter, about what happens if mixtures involving maaser and trumat maaser, what happens there? So the Rambam begins with an introductory point, and that is as follows: Haperes shehuram mehen, truma gedola, utrumas maaser. Produce from which you separated truma gedola, that's the regular truma, the 2% of the Kohen, and trumas maaser, that's the 10% of the 10% that goes to the Levi. Hein hanikroin chulin. If you separate these two gifts from the big sack, then the rest of the grain is called chulin, regular grain. Now there's still more to be separated. You still have to separate the Maaser Rishon for the Levi, the Maaser Sheni, take it to Jerusalem. But at this point, once the two trumas are separated, it's already called chulin, regular grain. V'im hifrish mehen sha'ar Maaser sehen. If you're a good Jew and you separate the other Maasers, now you have got all four, both trumas and the Maaser Rishon and the Maaser Sheni. Now hein hanikroin chulin misukanin. Now these are called fixed regular grain, like they've been fully taken care of, b'chol makom, in every place. In other words, in all of the Gemara and all of the Midrash and all of Halacha, whenever you see the term chulin, it means grain from which the trumas were separated. Whenever you see chulin misukanim, fixed chulin, it means grain from which all the gifts were separated. It says that Rambam, knowing this, Halacha beis tevel shenis ariv b'chulin misukanin min b'minoi. If you have tevel means untithed produce, nothing was taken from it. With chulin misukanin is the opposite extreme. All the gifts have been taken from it, and they got mixed up. So we remember from the laws of mixtures that if it's min b'she'eno mino, if it's two different species, so you always go after the taste. Have somebody taste it, have a non-Jew taste it. If you can taste the forbidden stuff, no good. If you can't taste it, it's good. Today we convert it to 60 times. If you have 60 times the amount, you're good. If not, no good. However, when it comes to min b'minoi, when it comes to a mixture of its own species, so you can't go after the taste. It's wheat and wheat. You can't taste the wheat. It's all wheat. So the Rambam says, if it's min b'minoi, she'i efshar lahalech acharatam, where you cannot go after the taste, so now you have a problem. Because tevel is what's called davar sheyesh lo matirin. It can ultimately become permitted. And when something can ultimately become permitted, it never becomes nullified when it gets mixed up. For example, chametz on Pesach. Chametz on Pesach, if chametz mixes with something else, it never becomes nullified, because in 8 days it's all going to be permitted. So it's tevel also. When you're going to separate the gift, it's all going to be permitted. So while it's in the mixture, it's totally forbidden. So what do you do? Im yesh le peiros acheros, if you have other produce besides for this sack, so then moitzi al oisei tevel truma u'maisers lefi cheshbon. Use the other produce to proportionally take truma and meiser for whatever is mixed into the pile. But if it doesn't have any other produce to use to exempt this untithed produce, so then the mixture, you have a mixture of tevel and totally fixed chulin, the whole thing is forbidden until you separate the two types of produce from each other. And the way you do it is, when you separate, mafsid min hachulin hamisukanin kedei trumas meiser shabatevel. You're going to end up forfeiting, you're going to end up losing from the good grain enough that would be considered trumas meiser from the tevel, which means 1/100th. Because if you think about it, and we're going to see this again repeated in today's chapter, every time you have a specific quantity of produce, so 2% is going to the Kohen, that's truma, 10% is going to the Levi as Meiser. Of that 10%, 1% goes to the Kohen as Trumas Meiser. So in the end of the day, if you're speaking about a pile of 100% of grain, 1% is going to end up being Trumas Meiser. So when the Rambam says here, and we're going to soon see what he means by this, but when you have a mixture, you have to divide it equally, plus forfeit enough of the Trumas Meiser. That means 1/100th of the Tevel mixture you're going to be forfeiting. And the Rambam now describes it. Keita, what does this look like? Meya sa'ashel tevel, shenis'are b'meya sa'ashel chulin misukanin. You have 200 pounds of grain got mixed up. 100 of them were tevel, totally untithed. 100 of them were chulin misukanin, totally tithed. Everything was taken. Truma, Meiser, Trumas Meiser, Meiser Sheni, everything. So, typically, you would just divide it in half, right? Go back to 100, 100. Mafrish min hakoil echadumeya. So here you have to take away 101. 100, that's the original tevel, plus 1% of what remains, which is the amount equivalent to Trumas Meiser and the tevel, and you're forfeiting that from the good grain. So the Rambam says, you separate 101, the chol shehifrish tevel, whatever you separate has to be considered tevel, including the extra one, the yishar tishim betesha chulin misukanin, and you're left with 99 of the good grain. Nimtza, mafsid, sa'acha, so in this case, where it's equal 100 to 100, you've lost 1 pound of grain that you could have had it for good grain, now it's being included in the tevel. V'cheinim haya oisei tevel, tavul litruma. Same thing, if let's say the tevel was completely tevel, not even the truma, not even the 2% was taken yet. Mafsid min achulin ha-mesukanin kedei truma utrumas meiser. You have to forfeit from the good grain now 3%. 1% which would be trumas meiser, and 2% which would be the truma. So you're losing 3%. But lama mafsid sa'azu. What is the reasoning for this forfeiture? If you know there's 200 pounds of good grain, if you know that there's 100 pounds of good grain, 100 pounds of bad grain, so just divide it in half and go home. Why do you have to forfeit one? It says that Rambam kedei shelo yoimar, so the person shouldn't make a mistake and think meya shehifrish hein meya shel chulin v'hameya shenisharu hu atevel. If you're going to divide it 100 to 100, you might end up thinking that the 100 which you took out is the good grain and the 100 that remains is the bad grain, which is not true. The 100 that you take out, that's the one that's tevel, and you must separate the tithes from it. So to make that recognizable, the rabbi said, you know what? Take the 100 and pull one more along with you, or 3 more in the case of where truma wasn't taken either, so that you'll recognize that that's the tevel, that's the problematic grain, and that's the one that has to be tithed. Same thing if you have it's not an even case of 100 and 100. Let's say the tevel was less than the chulin or more than the chulin. So the bottom line is you always go percentage-wise. Magbiya ha-tevel, take whatever you know was the tevel, ukidei trumas meiser shabatevel min chulin, and 1%, which would equal to 100th, which would equal to the trumas meiser of the tevel from the chulin. Oikidei truma utrumas meiser im haya ha-tevel tavel litruma, or 3%, enough for the truma and trumas meiser if the tevel hadn't even had truma taken from it. That covers the scenario where the two extremes got mixed. Full tevel, fully untithed produce, with full chulin misukanin, fully fixed produce. Now that Rambam will examine some other scenarios, similar scenarios. Halacha dalid b'cheinim nisarev meiser tavul b'chulin misukanin. You have, here we go, meiser tavul. Meiser tavul means all the produce is meiser. It came to the Levi's hand, but he hadn't yet taken the 10% to give to the Kohen. So the meiser, which hadn't yet had the trumas meiser taken, is mixed with fully fixed produce. Oyser b'kol shehu. So the mixture is prohibited, even at the smallest size. And the solution is the same as before. In Yeshle meiser acher, if the Levi has other meiser in stock, moitzi oisei al meiser hatovel, trumas meiser, moitzi oisei al meiser hatovel, trumas meiser lefi cheshbon. You use it to exempt the meiser which is doesn't have trumas meiser taken from it yet, and you take trumas meiser proportionally. However much meiser got mixed up, you know 10% of that goes to the Kohen, so take that 10% from the other produce. But if you don't have any other meiser, this is all you got, and it's mixed with chulin, magbiya ha-meiser shenisarev. So same thing. Take away, separate however much meiser you know got mixed in, umafsid min ha-chulin ha-misukanin, and you're going to also forfeit from the fixed chulin kedei trumas meiser sheba meiser ha-tavul, enough to cover the trumas meiser which was in that meiser. In other words, now it's 10%, not 1%. Because how much of meiser belongs to the Kohen? 10%. Keitza, what does this mean? Let's see the example. Meya meiser shenisari b'meya chulin misukanin. You have 200 pounds again. 100 is meiser, from which 10 are going to belong to the Kohen, and the other 100 are good, totally fixed grain. Mafrish min hakoil meya v'eser. Separate 110 because 100 is for sure meiser, and the other 10 is the trumas meiser amount that would be in the meiser. B'chol shehifrish meiser, whatever you separate is considered holier, like Meiser, v'hatishim hanisharis, hin chulin kishayu, the 90 that remain are chulin as they were. Same thing if it wasn't an even mixture. If it was more chulin than Meiser, or less chulin than Meiser. The key is, mafrish ha-Meiser, you always take away the amount that you know was originally Meiser, ukedei trumas Meiser, sheba Meiser atavel, mina chulin. And enough that would cover trumas Meiser in that amount of Meiser, which hadn't yet had the trumas Meiser taken from it. So basically, in simple English, you take the Meiser plus another 10% of that mixture. Halacha vav, another scenario. Tevel shenis arev b'Meiser tovel. So you have, they're both not so good basically. Fully untithed produce on one side, and untithed Meiser. That means the Levi got it already and he didn't give his 10% to the Kohen. Im haya ha-tevel, ka-Meiser, if it was an even mixture, so in this case 200 pounds, right? 100 are tevel and 100 are Meiser, which hadn't yet had trumas Meiser taken from them. Mafsid min ha-tevel kedei trumas Meiser shabai. So here, instead of pulling more to the tevel side, you're going to actually pull more to the Meiser side. And you're going to forfeit from the tevel the amount equal to the trumas Meiser in it, in other words, 1%. Ketzad, what does this mean? 100 pounds of tevel mixed with 100 pounds of Meiser, which hadn't had trumas Meiser taken from it. Mafrish echad umeya. You separate 101, v'zeh shehifrish Meiser. And that 101 is considered to be Meiser. V'tishim v'teisha hanisharis tevel. The 99 which remain are tevel. Haya ha-tevel meruba al ha-Meiser. If there wasn't an even mixture, if it was more tevel than Meiser. Mafrish ha-Meiser bilvad, v'layafsid min ha-tevel klum. Simply separate the Meiser amount and don't forfeit anything from the tevel. Why? Because you'll cause yourself more problems. Sheim yikra shein l'trumas Meiser shenitbal. If you're going to designate that 1% as trumas Meiser, nimtza ha-Meiser meduma b'trumas Meiser shel tevel she'olsa imay. So now that trumas Meiser, which is much holier than regular Meiser, is going to be mixed into the mixture of Meiser, causing the entire mixture to be forbidden. And therefore, in the case where there's more tevel than Meiser, just separate the Meiser and go home. Haya ha-Meiser meruba ala tevel, if there was more Meiser than tevel. Kairei sheim trumas Meiser sheba tevel, designate that 1% of trumas Meiser in the tevel mixture. Umafrish ha-tevel ukedei trumas Meiser shel tivloi, echad mimeya min ha-Meiser, take away all the mixture that you know as tevel, plus that 1%, which you just designated, 100th from the Meiser, v'yiyah ha-tevel kulei meduma, which will cause the entire mixture of tevel to become problematic because you now have a piece that's trumas Meiser in it. And sell it to the Kohen for a cheaper price, excluding the amount of the two trumas that are inside it, the trumas Meiser which is inherently inside it, and the one that you designated later, also exclude that from the sale. The nimtza mafsid min ha-Meiser echad mimeya shabai, which will cause you to forfeit from the Meiser half, 100th, 1%, shehu kamay trumas Meiser sheba tevel, which equals to the amount of trumas Meiser in tevel, because every time you have a pile of tevel, 1% is trumas Meiser. Ketzah, what does this practically mean? Let's look at a case. Meya tevel im masayim Meiser. 300 pounds. 100 are tevel, 200 are Meiser. Mafrish meya v'shalish. What you have to do is separate 103. 100 is the tevel, plus 3%. What's the 3% for? V'hashalosh hein trumas Meiser shel meya tevel, v'shir trumas Meiser mi masayim. The 3 are the 1% of the tevel, trumas Meiser, and the 2% trumas Meiser from the 200 of Meiser. The reason we do this is so we don't make a mistake when it's an even mixture. We always take away that whatever could have been trumas Meiser. The Yishar Kuf Tzadik Zayin, the Hey Meiser Kishahayu, leaving 197 Meiser as they were. Okay, the last 3 halachas are fairly simple. Misha Hayulay Eser Shurais Shal Eser Eser Kadeyayin. A person has 100 barrels of wine, 10 by 10. That's how he stacks them, 10 by 10 rows. The Kava Kad Achas Mishura Hachitzayna Meiser Al Makem Acher. Besides for all this wine, he has other wine, and he looks at this pile. He says, one barrel in one of the outer rows is going to be Meiser for all my other wine. And then he forgets. He doesn't know which outer row. Look at this picture. There's 4 outer rows. This is an outer row. This is an outer row. This is an outer row. And this is an outer row. He said one of the barrels in one of the outer rows. So how do you get away with the least? Says the Rambam, Noitel shtei chaviyos ba'al achzain. take two diagonally opposite barrels, uma'arev shtehen, mix them together, umafrish mehen, and take one barrel amount from the mixture. Because if you take a barrel from here, you cover these two rows, right? And you take a barrel from here, you cover these two rows. So that's all you need is to take two barrels and you've covered all four rows. Halacha ches, kva'a bechatzi shura hachitzayna. What if he said, I'm going to give one barrel from a half of the outer rows? So there are 8 halves, right? Because there are 4 outer rows, 2 halves in each row. You don't know which half row you meant. Noitel arba chaviyos me arba zaviyos. So you take this side, here, one barrel from each corner, and you've covered all the half rows, because every barrel in the corner covers 2 half rows. Easy. Kava b'shura achas mehan. Ve'en yodua ezu shurahi. If you said a barrel from one of the rows, not from one of the outer rows. So now you're a little more stuck. And the way to take care of it, the easiest is noitel shura achas ba'alachsa, and take one whole row diagonally. See? You cross the row over here. Now every barrel covers 2 rows. So you're good by just taking 10 barrels. Now in the end, you're going to mix them all together and just take one barrel amount. But the point is you have to take them from a mixture of all 10 barrels. Kava b'chatzi shura. Same thing if you said one of the barrels in one of the half rows, ve'en yodua ezu chatzi shura, you don't know which half row, noitel shtei shuras ba'alachsa, and you take 2 diagonal rows, as in an X, crossing every half row. Shahare notal chavis mikol chatzi shura, in which case you took a barrel from every half row, uma'arev umafrish, mix them together and separate as meiser. Kava ha-meiser bekad achas meyan. What if you said one of the barrels? You didn't say half row, row, so now you're really stuck. One of the barrels. Ve'en yodua ezuhi. You don't know which one it is. So the Rambam says in this case, you're stuck. Noitel mikol kad v'kad min hameya. You must take from every single barrel a little bit of wine from the 100. Uma'arev, mix them all together. Umafrish kedei kad achas, and then put aside the amount that would fill up one barrel. Uma'aser, and use that to take meiser for whatever other wine you had in mind.